former President Jimmy Carter passes away at the age of 100. According to his son, Jimmy Carter died at his home in Plains, Georgia. He is the longest lived former president in our nation's history. Carter, a Nobel Peace Prize winner, humanitarian, 39th president of the United States, is survived by his 4 children and multiple grandchildren. His wife, Rosalind Carter, passed away at the couple's home in November 2023 at the age of 96. Prominent Black figures from all over the country took to the web to express their condolences to the Carter family and pay respects to what many called a great leader. In a written statement on Medium, former President Barack Obama praised Carter, posting, "President Carter taught all of us what it means to live a life of grace, dignity, justice, and service. Michelle and I send our thoughts and prayers to the Carter family and everyone who loved and learned from this remarkable man." NAACP President Derrick Johnson also paid respects to the former president, saying, quote, "Jimmy Carter not only championed civil rights as POTUS, where he set a record for Black appointments, including the first Black woman in the cabinet, but he devoted his life to human rights. He served all Americans and embodied true leadership. Quote, rest in power, Mr. President." Stacey Abrams would post, "President Carter lived a life of courage, fortitude, kindness, and grace. He was a giant who never saw anyone as smaller than himself, whether at a Boys and Girls Club banquet or when he sponsored a medical clinic for the uninsured in his corner of rural Georgia. He lived James 2:17 each day. Jimmy Carter built homes, saved lives, and tended to souls. God bless President Carter. May the family he and Mrs. Carter raised know only comfort in these days of grief." I'm going to give you some background about President Carter. The former peanut farmer and Georgia governor became the 39th president of the United States from 1977 to 1981. Ironically, I was born in 1981 in that same state. After beating Republican incumbent President Gerald Ford in the 1976 election, his campaign focused on regaining the trust of the American people after Richard Nixon resigned during the Watergate scandal. The Carter administration faced multiple challenges, including the 1979 oil shortage, which resulted in high gas prices and long lines in the US. He struggled to end the Iranian hostage crisis when students in Tehran seized the US embassy, took 52 American hostages for 444 days. Many historians point to that as one of the biggest reasons behind the resounding defeat to Ronald Reagan that took place in 1980. And one of his greatest accomplishments, Carter brought together the Egyptian president and the Israeli prime minister at the presidential retreat in Camp David. This was in 1978. They agreed to the Camp David Accords, which ended the state of war that had existed between the two countries since 1948. He was tough on the Soviet Union during the Cold War. Carter ordered an embargo on the shipment of American grain to the Soviet Union and boycotted the 1980 Summer Olympics in Moscow over Russia's invasion of Afghanistan. The rural Georgian politician had taken stances in favor of integration. At his Baptist church, Carter and his wife, the late Rosalind Carter, were 2 of the only 3 congregants to vote in favor of integration. He later joined an integrated church, an integrated Baptist church, Maranatha Baptist Church. And as renewed segregationist sentiment swept through the South after Brown versus Board of Education, Carter was one of the only white men in his community to refuse to join the local chapter of the White Citizens Council, which was a de facto white supremacist group. Quote, civil rights leaders felt comfortable negotiating with him, says Andrew Gillespie, an American politics professor at Emory University, where Carter also served as a professor himself. That didn't mean Carter and civil rights leaders always say eye to eye. During one of Gillespie's classes that Carter guest lectured, she says he described a moment of tension between himself and civil rights leaders during negotiations of the Humphreys-Hawkins Act, which sought to grant full employment to Americans. Despite these tensions, Carter accomplished a lot for the Black community while in office, says Gillespie. Quote, for his time, he had the most diverse cabinet that anybody prior to that had had, she says. And as a former president, Gillespie said he continued to push for racial equality. Quote, when President Obama was in office and Republicans were openly talking about obstructing him with a goal of trying to ruin his chances for re-election, he was the only one who was on television and said, that's racist, says Gillespie. Gillespie says that Obama likely would have struggled to make the argument himself as a Black man and current president, but that Carter did not have to sugarcoat it. Quote, he just straight up said these attacks are racist to try to use his political capital to be able to shake people into realizing that the attacks against Obama were more than just partisan posturing, says Professor Gillespie. I think that's an example of allyship. Outside of his work in politics, Gillespie says that Carter's humanitarian work with groups like Habitat for Humanity have directly benefited Black people in the United States and globally. I have more, and I want to pause at this moment. My first time meeting President Carter was at a Habitat for Humanity Build on a Dream day. This was years ago, perhaps 15 to 17 years ago. On Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday, on the celebration of the birthday, we would build a house literally in 24 to 48 hours for a deserving family in a local community. This is something that President Carter spearheaded. That was my first time meeting him in South Georgia, Albany to be exact. Carter spent decades in a frenetic and often freelancing pursuit of global peacemaking and global healing. Rosalind was always at his side and as much a partner as ever, though he became more and more active in the Middle East peace process. He grew more radical, according to many, in his views or support for an independent Palestinian state and his outspoken criticism of Israel. He was a regular presence in Latin America, convened arms control experts at his Carter Center in Atlanta, and launched efforts to eradicate disease in Africa. I want to go back to the Carter Center. I happen to be a senior advisor to the Carter Center. I've worked there for a few years now. I'm a co-director for their Democracy Resilience Program. And the reason is because President Carter realized that we could not thoughtfully talk about violence in democracy as it relates to other nations and not address the violence in democracy as it relates to the United States of America. So President Carter made a decision to do something that no other presidential center has ever done. That is to get involved in domestic politics right here in America. I was one of the first directors hired for that post. I am still there right now. This is a tough day for every single one of us. It's rare to have someone with actual leadership, power, and frankly, some entanglements, some friendships and allyships that may disagree with you, to have that person still stand up for people that really can't stand up for him. He did not weigh the political measure in order to weigh his moral responsibility. He stood up for people because it was right to do. That kind of individual deserves to be celebrated. Jackson, thoughts?
First and foremost, it's kind of hard to do better than 100. You
Yeah.
make it up that far, especially if it's a life well lived. What more do you really need to do? And Jimmy Carter was well before my time, so I didn't get to experience him. But I think he's really an interesting character in the sense of true representation of what evangelism is supposed to be. What a stark difference, because as far as I know, he was an evangelical Christian, but truly embodied what that's supposed to be about: service to others, thinking about the little guy, going out of your way to make the world good. And also a true example of what I now believe in my life, that it's really all of our responsibilities at the end of the day, no matter what it is that you do, to make the world good, to make the world better, to understand your connection to other people and how everybody really is just you. Even the living things, the grass that you walk on, is all an extension of yourself. And I think that Jimmy Carter really is a strong, powerful example for that. But I also want to point out, just, when you look at someone like Jimmy Carter and the other people that Americans have elected, the range that America has. We can put someone like him in office, and then directly after him, here comes Ronald Reagan, and his whole thing was a countercultural movement to the Civil Rights Act. That's really what that all was about. That's how it was sold. Welfare queens. That's how the whole thing was sold. Then you fast forward, you get to Obama. Obviously, he's a centrist, so it's not like he was some huge progressive stalwart or anything like that. But then directly after him, we have a countercultural movement in Donald Trump, and evangelicals backing a man like Donald Trump, an adjudicated rapist, a man who's just completely ridiculous, doesn't know anything that's going on, all the felonies he had, literally tried to overthrow the government, all the trouble he's been in, all the scandals, all the cons, all the scamming, and millions and millions and millions of Americans voted for this dude 3 times. So it's really interesting to really think about what Americans are capable of embracing. But we've seen that we're capable of embracing somebody like Jimmy Carter. So I think that there's huge silver linings for new leadership potential in the future. But everything that I've known and seen from and about Jimmy Carter just really is somebody that I think people should work to emulate. And I think that he was a great man.
Very well said, and I concur. For those who would like to get involved and get more information about the Democracy Resilience Network, you can simply Google that term, connect it to the Carter Center. There are multiple states that have enacted this program, including the state of Georgia, the state of Florida, and more. I encourage you to get involved domestically if you have not already done so. We have to protect the sanctity of people having the right to choose their elected leaders without fear of violence or retaliation.